Mr. Director General, dear Matthias, members of the academic staff, personnel of CIFE, dear students, of course, ladies and gentlemen. I will try to summarize a complex situation for the world and for the European Union and its member states in a few words without falling into simplism. Those words are unity, democracy, autonomy, long-term, and more Europe. So the first key word is unity. We live in societies that are fragmented because individualization has become a feature of our times. Apparently, every person has his or her own truth. I'm quoting the famous Italian author Pirandello. There is, of course, nothing wrong with debate and dissent or with freedom of opinion and emancipation, but there can be a downside in terms of lack of openness and lack of real dialogue, and a downside in terms of hostility towards those who think differently or are differently. There should always be, that's my personality also, there should always be readiness to listen to others. If you listen to people, you show respect, which is the recognition of a person's unique value. Besides individualization, there is a growing sense of insecurity and fear that has many causes in today's societies and economies. Moreover, there is now also the awareness of living in a dangerous world due to wars on our borders and climate disasters. There are fears that current wars could turn into nuclear wars, and that climate disasters could strike anywhere and unexpectedly as a kind of fate, as a kind of nemesis. It is the return of tragedy in history. Negative emotions, anxiety, fear, uncertainty, sometimes breed extremism and weaken moderation. This anxiety is also visible in the deficits in mental well-being, burnout, depression, suicide, addictions, especially among youngsters. I have no immediate solution to this, but we need to look lucidly at the world we live in. These changes in civilization, because it is about civilization, these changes in civilization will not suddenly get resolved. Civilization change slower than economic markets or electoral results. The state of our societies is reflected in our democracies. The multiplicity and volatility of individual opinions and emotions translate into volatile election results and into a fragmented political landscape with many, many political parties. It makes governing difficult at all levels of power. And the EU is the sum of 27 divided democracies and societies. But the EU institutions, and I emphasize the word institutions, are less blocked and more capable of making decisions than is often said. In the European Parliament, the President of the European Commission was elected recently with a solid majority. The two far-right minority groups represent only about 20% of the seats. I say only, it's important, but there are 80% others than the far-right and extremists. And within populism, moreover, there are important differences on policies. Not all populists are anti-Western or pro-Putin. Certainly not. And in spite of the political fragmentation, the European Council of Heads of State and Heads of Government are mostly found consensus in recent years. It is not because a small country is creating difficulties that 98% of the rest of the Union is paralyzed. Unanimity is needed for major decisions in the European Union. We know this. It's a tough rule, and it is an uphill task, but this consensus has also been found every 6 months so far, for instance, for the sanctions against Russia. So the EU institutions are less blocked than it is often said. Compared to the Union, the United States is even more heavily divided politically and has actually become an almost blocked society. The French speak decades ago about une société bloquée. Brexit split the UK into two camps hostile to each other. And in dictatorships, there is an apparent unity until the bomb bursts, as happened in 1989, when the Soviet Union broke up totally unexpectedly. By the way, other empires in the plural will disintegrate in the future. History is full of surprises, and that we know since 1989. It is often said that the EU has become irrelevant globally. Are other global actors relevant? Question mark. What is the US influence on Israel and in the Near East in general? Question mark. To ask the question is to answer it. How many wars has the US already lost since Vietnam? I will show later that Russia has lost control over 200 million people since 1989, since the fall of the Berlin Wall. On the other hand, EU member states have no need to control the world and its seas as they did during colonialism. The comparison with that era is for us irrelevant. It's over. We closed that chapter of our history. The next few years are bound to be tense for the European Union and its member states, because the two largest countries have become politically less stable internally. Both France and Germany have minority governments today or not a government at all. This makes cooperation between France and Germany difficult. The respective governments are permanently preoccupied today with internal survival. The EU has always needed the Franco-German engine, especially on socio-economic issues. We miss it today. The European Commission cannot fully take over that role because it can only make proposals, but the big decisions lie with the European Council of the 27 heads of state and heads of government. And those big decisions will be needed to continue supporting Ukraine, to set up a European industrial policy, to cope with unfair and fair competition from the US and China, to fight fierce climate change. We need big decisions. The US regime change, recent regime change, increases the pressure on the European Union. Individual EU countries can never win those battles. We need much more European cooperation and integration, not less European integration and cooperation. The EU is part of the West. We have seen a revival of the West and the G7 in the last 4 years, and a strong NATO that even welcomed 2 new members. After the American elections, after November the 5th, the EU will have to take even more its fate into its own hands and become even more what we call strategically autonomous, even more sovereign, European sovereignty. Unity in itself is valuable, but it must be unity to achieve something, to get results for our citizens, to create a more prosperous, a more sustainable, and more happy society. That were a few reflections under the theme of unity. What about the second key word, democracy? The next few years will not just be about the economy or about money, however important, but about values. And one of those key public values is democracy. For this, by the way, other personal values are indispensable, such as respect for every human person and his or her dignity, such as openness, another value, and dialogue. So public values need the support of personal values. Without this moral base, there will be no lasting support for fundamental freedoms, rule of law, and an independent judiciary, fairness in the distribution of wealth and prosperity. Today, the trust, the belief of a part of our citizens, around 20%, the faith in democracy has declined sharply in Western Europe, going as far as preferring authoritarianism. The US will elect, or have elected, a president who staged a coup 4 years ago. However, the same skeptics of democracy cannot imagine that they will have to keep quiet on social media in an authoritarian regime, and that they will only be left with obedience, the contrary of today's society where people are used to enormous freedoms. This addiction to freedom, this addiction to debate reassures me about the future of democracy in the longer run. But we shouldn't take risks. Democracy can remain formally, but cyber wars and manipulation through monopolization of digital power in the hands of a few individuals erode the system. Besides, we are experiencing an almost 19th century concentration of power, concentration of wealth. And the EU is the only power, the only global power to act against it. Today, pillars of democracy and the rule of law are under threat in a number of countries. The EU is cracking down on them, but what might happen if radical parties made in some big countries outside Poland, where they lost the elections? What will happen if something is happening in France, for instance? Our democracies must be defended against external and internal enemies. The parties of the center should only cooperate with pro-European, pro-Ukraine, and pro-democracy parties. Moderates sometimes think they are smart by cooperating with that kind of non-like-minded parties, but they dig their own graves. However, democracies must also pursue policies on security, purchasing power, illegal migration, and climate change. Results will eventually convince people of the added value of democracies. We need performing policies on security, purchasing power, illegal migration, and climate. We need the Europe of the results. I emphasize democratic values because a Europe in the grip of extremists of all kinds would have major political repercussions also on our foreign policy, on the role of Europe in the world. Extremists in Germany have recently been successful in regional elections because they no longer want to support Ukraine. This evolution could therefore have geopolitically dramatic consequences, starting with Ukraine itself. Domestic policy determines foreign policy. The extremists have a dangerous external agenda. Security is not an isolated issue from other policies. Without internal political stability, there is no external stability in the longer term. My third keyword is autonomy. For too long, many in the European Union have had a blind faith in the primacy of economics. There was a good reason for this. Trading with each other within the Union made us dependent from each other and countered the tendency to go to war. After all, war would destroy the shared prosperity to which so many citizens were attached. The naivety was to think that what was good for the European Union was also good for the world. We are no longer living in a harmonious world without tragedies. For other global actors, there is the primacy not of economics, but of politics, and the primacy of nationalism, the primacy of the glory of the nation state, the opposite of what we are trying to do in the European Union since 75 years. Moreover, in Russia, the drive for reconquista, the drive for reconquest, to restore the Soviet Empire prevails, also with weapons, and even at the cost of hundreds of thousands of human lives. For them, not every person counts, not even a Russian soldier. This difference with the EU view implies that we live in two different civilizations, certainly at the level of political systems. A second reason for the end of our naivety is that some countries do not play by the rules. They subsidize exports and investments or will impose tariffs to make imported goods and services more expensive than their own. In the 30s, this was called a beggar my neighbor policy. Countries try to solve their problems unilaterally at the detriment of the others. We have come to realize, after the first Trump years, 2016 to 2020, we have come to realize after the invasion of Ukraine and after Chinese assertiveness globally, that we as Europeans need to take our destiny much more in our own hands. We continue to believe in open markets as long as they not jeopardize our security and if everyone abides by international agreements and rules. The Europeans now, the EU institutions, use their new trade defense instruments to protect us against unfair competition. We protect ourselves, we protect without falling into protectionism. It's much more than just playing with words. Our strategic sectors and activities should not fall into the hands of non-like-minded countries. We Europeans are behind on, for instance, electric cars and artificial intelligence. We have to catch up. Our climate policy towards renewable energy will make us much less dependent on imported fossil fuels. We have already largely and very quickly freed ourselves from Russian gas. We need to become more competitive on the global markets. not so much through low costs, but through innovation and by forming powerful, large European companies. Scale, size matters globally. For example, on economic competition, we should not only look at whether some of our companies are too dominant in our own single market, but ensure that our companies are large and competitive enough in the global markets. At the same time, we need to create a true European capital markets union to provide also startups with sufficient funds in a timely manner. Mario Draghi confirmed what we already largely knew, but gave it a sense of urgency. If we want to be and remain strategically autonomous and prosperous, this will come at a price. We need to give the European Commission another chance to provide its own European funding, as we did in the COVID era with the recovery fund of 800 billion euros. I know a number of countries are opposed to it, that are against. They have not yet understood this and are still prisoners of the concept of national sovereignty of the past. It is not a time for calculators of national benefits or costs, but for European daredevils. Even in the EU, taboos have to fall again. In the 1960s, I was young in the 60s, the then EU was also lagging behind the United States. Famous book about the American challenge, Le Défi Américain. The book was published in 1967. We made up our ground through Delors' single market in the 80s. Now we have less time for catching up. And Germany in particular needs to end the economic stagnation it has fallen into. Germany needs another economic miracle, as they did in the past. But one country alone can no longer do that. That time has passed. The Draghi report is a long plea for more Europe, not for less Europe. In short, we need to become much more autonomous and thus less dependent on military security, on food, energy, batteries, lithium, chips, artificial intelligence, illegal migration, you name it. The greater European sovereignty is not an end in itself, but a means to sustain the European social models and our democracies. We do not want to make Europe great again, but neither do we want it to be made small. My fourth word is long-term vision. Short-term thinking is typical of a mentality of too many people in our societies and democracies, and in parts of the economy. Regarding the economy, the financial crisis has taught us how dangerous, reckless, egocentric, and greedy behavior is. Complacency is another cause of short-termism. The European automotive industry missed the train of electric cars and is now condemned to race to catch up. They thought they were unbeatable. They discovered that they are. Growing societal individualization and political fragmentation automatically bring short-termism. The preference for the hic et nunc, here and now, and my national interest first. After all, political parties have often become too small to take big political and electoral risks needed for future-oriented projects. Climate policy is precisely in function of the longer term, although we are already seeing today the negative consequences of climate change. I am, of course, thinking of the dramatic flooding in Central Europe, in Spain, as the Belgians experienced in Wallonia 2 years ago. The Commission proposed a courageous climate plan, the so-called Green Deal, called these days the Clean Deal. And the Council and the Parliament approved the Green Deal. As it became concrete, support from parts of the population and from the private sector decreased. We are agreeing on big objectives for the future, but when it becomes concrete, we are less enthusiastic. Of course, there must be room for adjustments and amendments on the Green Deal, but the direction and where possible the speed of the deal must be maintained. I thought disasters would wake people up, that crises create opportunities to do things differently. I need to clarify this today. A number of people are unwilling to move as long as the climate disaster does not affect them personally. I would add also that spontaneous solidarity is high when there are catastrophes. Climate is also existential for humanity. Therefore, it cannot be the subject of geopolitical rivalry. Cooperation on climate change, for instance, with China, should be possible. Long-term vision for the European Union also entails decisively opting for its enlargement. Some member states look at enlargement with a calculator in the hand. What will it cost to me? They miss the bigger picture, a vision of Europe as a continent of peace and democracy, as a continent of values. If the current Central European countries had not joined the EU in 2004 and 2007, Russia would have threatened them as they are doing now with Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. And Central Europe is even closer to Western Europe than Ukraine. So the danger is all the greater for the Western Europeans. The 27 should recognize that Russia is trying to regain ground after losing control of 100 million people in Central Europe, the so-called satellite countries, in Central Europe and in the Baltics, in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. But all this on top of the less of another 100 million people in the eastern part of Europe and in Central Asia, now living in independent states. They lost the control over 200 million people. By enlargement, I mean mainly towards the countries of the Eastern Partnership, especially Ukraine, and of the Western Balkans. At least if the countries there really want it themselves. It needs to tango. Of course, candidate members must respect what we call the acquis communautaire, subscribe to the Union's common foreign and security policy, and live the democratic values in word and in deed. We have enough problems with existing members not doing that. China lost much attractiveness in the EU due to its, what is called, friendship without limits with Russia and its lack of real neutrality. With Russia, we are decoupling almost completely across the board. With China, we are de-risking, not decoupling. We are de-risking a balance between our economic and our security interests. China is a partner, a competitor, a systemic rival, but it also became the friend of an enemy. It changed our relationship dramatically. As Europeans, we cannot be focused only on our own continent. And therefore, we must forge alliances on a global scale. In recent years, we concluded successful free trade agreements with Japan, with Vietnam, Canada, New Zealand, and it is unfortunate that the Mercosur agreement with Brazil and Argentina has not yet been finalized, partly also because of continuing objections within the European Union. But we are close to an agreement on Mercosur. I hope we will conclude before Christmas. We should not be naive, but neither should we be closed. I could also talk about Africa, with its immeasurable mineral resources and high potential for migration due to the gigantic population explosion. Up from 1.2 billion today, African population, to possibly 4 billion by 2100. Again, the EU is taking initiatives, but not convincingly enough. A long-term view is not an intellectual concept, but a geopolitical or geoeconomic praxis. The war in Ukraine should definitively free us from sleepwalking. The consumer society and the 70 years of peace make us quickly succumb to easy and quick solutions and to falling back on ourselves. But there is no room anymore for business as usual. Those who cling too much to short-term stability by letting things go and not taking responsibility reap instability in the long run. In general, we should have the mindset of investors, less the mindset of consumers. The long term also has a demographic dimension. The European Union, Russia, China, Korea, Japan are facing more and more population decline and aging. We have known the figures for decades. It's nothing new. Politics does not have much control over the numbers of births, although much more can be done on child-friendly family policies. The more economically productive we are, the less need there is for migrant workers compensating lower birth rates. Higher productivity relates to economic and industrial policy. And over the last 20 years, product per man-hour productivity in the US grew twice as fast as in good old Europe. The digital revolution is not yet revolutionary enough in the European Union. If we want to stem future mass labor migration, if we have to opt for a bold policy that gets us out of the slow growth of productivity per man and per hour, by fully engaging in the digital and environmental transition, we have to opt for a bold policy. There is another argument for higher productivity growth. Level of public debt in many Western countries are running at multi-decade highs. Meanwhile, the cost of servicing that debt has risen and the rate of GDP growth has fallen. Aging populations and the rising cost of welfare and health will exert powerful upward pressure on government spending over the coming decades. It is a problem for the entire Western world, not only for Europe. America's annual deficit is now around 6 or 7% of GDP, almost twice as large as that of the Eurozone, which is now 3.6%. US public sector debt has risen from 36% in 2004 to almost 100% of GDP today. And by 2054, it will stand at 166% of GDP. Eurozone sovereign debt was as high as 88% of GDP in 2023. By the way, China is also struggling with a debt economy, a debt in the sense of high debt economy, especially with local governments. Avoiding an ever-rising burden of debt today requires long-term planning beyond the lifetime of any government or parliament. We are in the chapter of the long term. All this requires political courage that the populist parties lack in any case because they want to be or remain popular. Never forget that the aim of a populist is to remain popular. For a stronger industrial policy and higher productivity, we need more Europe. Individual member states cannot cope with that challenge alone. And my last key word is about, and I mentioned it already on several occasions, more European cooperation and integration. Do we need a new European treaty for a better functioning of the European Union? Question. I would add that I myself am in favor of amendments in the treaties rather than a general overhaul of the treaties. For instance, I'm in favor of an amendment in the treaties on the unanimity rule for major decisions. A general overhaul of the treaties is an exercise that takes years. The last exercise leading to the Lisbon Treaty took 8 years. We shouldn't get caught up in a big institutional debate that divides member states and citizens at a dangerous time when we absolutely need unity. This is not the right time for starting with a big overhaul of the European treaties. I mentioned the need for more Europe already several times. For the sake of unity, it is not a good idea to weaken one of the pillars of the Union by reintroducing national border controls and endangering the passport-free Schengen zone. We also need to further strengthen the economic and monetary union, the second pillar of the European Union. Little work has been done on this, on strengthening and deepening the economic and monetary union over the last 12 years. The priority today is the European Capital Markets Union. The third pillar, the single market, the largest in the world, is not yet single enough, especially for services. Enrico Letta's report pointed this out very well. So we have to, when we speak about more Europe, we should not abandon the three pillars, current pillars of the European Union. All this does not mean that nothing has happened in the Union to achieve all these objectives mentioned in this account. On the contrary, a number of reforms such as the CHIP Act, the Critical Raw Materials Act, or the Pact on Asylum and Migration are in progress, and others are under construction. Evidence of this are the increase of national and European defense budgets and the strengthening of military cooperation with NATO and within the Union. Evidence of this is also the huge support we gave to Ukraine. We have to implement the Green Deal and start implementing the Draghi proposals. Dear friends, we know what to do. There is not a shortage of ideas. We need the Europe of the results. We must also be prepared for the possibility of unforeseen developments that will necessitate a unified and forceful response. I'm thinking, of course, of the current change of power in the United States and all its consequences on the war in Ukraine, which is an existential for the Union. When things are going wrong in Ukraine, this is an existential problem for the EU of the 27 for the reasons I already mentioned. And that's why we need strong European institutions and stronger member states. It is possible that we may react in the future more united and stronger than feared, as we surprisingly did in the pandemic and in the first months of the Russian invasion. As a matter of fact, the Union has surprised many throughout its young history and in the recent past. We even surprised ourselves. We were during the pandemic and in the beginning of the war in Ukraine, we were more united and more decisive than most people all over the world expected. To summarize and to repeat, the European leaders have to take responsibility at a time when security, climate, competitiveness, and democracy are central. We must take our destiny into our own hands much more after November the 5th. We must not be strategically dependent, but strategically autonomous. Certainly on defense, on energy, on food, migration, digital technologies, and others. We did not create a European market to be dominated by non-European companies. We have to protect it without falling into protectionism. On climate, private and group interests should not dominate the common good for humanity. We are behind in too many domains. The Commission proceeds with a clear goal, but is flexible in the path towards it. Fundamental on the end, without being fundamentalists on the means. The Commission is going to play an even bigger role in the next 5 years, especially as the Franco-German engine disappoints today. Perhaps an even more important goal than any other is to safeguard democracy in the European Union and in the West. There are internal and external enemies of our democracy. Much is at stake. Democracy can be temporary. Nevertheless, I remain a man of hope. We badly need hope. Hope is a verb. We have to create our own hope. It is not passive, but an active concept. Hope is the opposite of fear. It is an expression of vitality, is an expression of life. Fear paralyzes and weakens. Therefore, I do my utmost to remain a man of hope. Thank you so much.